Hello, this is our sixth and final lesson on Christianity and other religions. And let me share my screen here. Today's topic is Christianity and Postmodernism. The messages before were on Christianity and Judaism, and then Islam, the Eastern religions, the cults, and secular humanism. And this one is on Christianity and postmodernism. And our purpose is to focus on our own Christian faith and how we should respond to others. Now, postmodernism is a little bit tough to define. It's a little bit like trying to nail Jello to the wall, but it's very, very influential in our culture today. And so I think I can use a few examples to maybe draw a little bit of a line around what it means to have a postmodern worldview. Let's start with a question. Can a man get pregnant? Okay, so if you were to have a question like that asked to you by maybe your 3-year-old child, I think you would take the question very seriously and say, no, sweetheart, only women can get pregnant, but men can't get pregnant. Also, if you ask that question to any of the great secular humanists we discussed in our previous lesson or any others and ask them, can a man get pregnant? They would think that's a ridiculous question. How could you, is this a trick? How would you even say something like that? In effect, they would give the same answer that Christians would give. They would say no. That's what the secular humanists would say. However, as I mentioned in our lesson on secular humanism last week, the secular humanists have not won. They have lost the culture wars, and they've lost to the postmodernists. Now, the secular humanists and the postmodernists have the same beginning point where they say there is no God, or if there is a God, it really doesn't matter. But where they went after that is different. When I asked Google, can a man get pregnant? I got these answers, and they all came up on the first page. So this is not a fringe website or something. This was Google on the very first page. One says, yes, it's possible for men to become pregnant and give birth to children of their own. In fact, it's probably a lot more common than you might think. And the second one says, men can get pregnant. Planned Parenthood doctor tells Congress. And that last one is my brother's pregnancy and the making of a new American family. So it puts us in strange new world. Here's another one. This is the confirmation hearing for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And Senator Marsha Blackburn asked the Supreme Court nominee on Tuesday to define the word woman. I can't, Jackson replied. You can't, Blackburn said. Not in this context. I'm not a biologist, Jackson said. The meaning of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition? Blackburn asked. Now, obviously, these kinds of questions, can you say what a woman is and can a man get pregnant, are things where we used to know the answer, but we don't know the answer anymore, incredibly. Postmodernism. Postmodernism is characterized by rejecting rationality, objectivity, and universal truth. So, like the secular humanists, they would agree that there is no God, but the secular humanists support the ideas of rationality, objectivity, and absolute truth. But postmodernists don't. You might hear them using terms like your truth or my truth rather than the truth. Postmodernism emphasizes diversity of experience and multiple perspectives on what's going on. And in this lesson, I am not talking about postmodernism in the arts, although that's sort of a different thing, though it's not entirely unconnected to postmodernism in general. This scripture in Romans 1, beginning in verse 18, is very descriptive, I think, of what has happened in our world, which has led us to where we have a postmodern worldview. Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." First step in the descent into foolishness was rejecting God and claiming to be wise, but they became fools. Passage goes on. "Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they knew God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." So this slide down begins with a rejection of God himself, and it ends up in all kinds of not just foolishness, but also evil behavior. Let me show you a picture that I saw this week in the news. As I'm writing this, this is about 1 week after Hamas launched an attack on Israel, and it was really sort of a massacre there on the first day where they killed many innocent civilians. And at this time, some people across the world were celebrating and demonstrating in favor of Hamas. And this group here is called Queers for Palestine. Now, I have 3 comments about this. First of all, the first thing I guess you would say that was wrong about it is the orientation, the queers part. The second thing is to demonstrate in favor of Hamas several days after this terrible terrorist attack is immoral. But even a little bit more, I think the thing I'd like to focus on is, does this even make sense? You know, if this queer group decided that they would go knock on the doors of Islamic militants, Hamas, in some place where Hamas was in control, and ask Hamas to start using their designated pronouns, the result would be unpleasant. It's contradictory to be queer and in favor of Islamic militants. Hopefully these folks some of them would have enough common sense, maybe, that they wouldn't get too close to Islamic militants. But the fact is, it's contradictory, but they don't care. In a postmodern world, they care not about right and wrong. They make their own right and wrong. And they care not about reason. So they just go with whatever cause they like or whatever they favor, whatever feels good. And that's where we are in the postmodern world. Friedrich Nietzsche could be considered the father of postmodernism. He said, God is dead. And Last week we talked a little bit about the argument for reason, where some of the Christians, like C.S. Lewis, had argued that if you start by saying God is dead, and then even all the thoughts in my head are based on accidental factors, based going all the way back to the Big Bang, but then that would even infect my reason. So your reason is even based on something that's unreasonable. So Lewis says you can't go there. So therefore, there has to be a God. Well, in the postmodern world, the people have jumped the other way. They said God is dead. He really is dead. And so reason is no use. There is no use. There's no facts. There's only, you can have an interpretation. That's where Nietzsche went, and that's where the postmodern world has gone. In John chapter 8, Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, he said, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What if you don't abide in his word? Then conversely, you will not know the truth, and you will not be free. Is there absolute truth? In a postmodern world, they would say, no, there is no absolute truth. A majority of Americans under 30 in a recent poll said, no, there is no absolute truth. So let's look at that statement. There is no absolute truth. Is that statement absolutely true? Because if it's true, then there is absolute truth. You just said it. But if it is not, then there is absolute truth. So even to say this is a contradiction on its face. There has to be absolute truth. It's unreasonable to say any other. Tolerance is a big issue in the postmodern world, but it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Tolerance used to mean, and it would be kind of a good thing, that we would put up with people who believed or thought or acted differently from us. But in a postmodern world, tolerance implies an insistence that we understand that all views are equal, all views are equally valid. In the Christian faith, that is not something we can deal with. Our Christianity teaches there's one way of salvation and all other ways fail. Acts 4:12 says, there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. John 14:6 said, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So there's no other way. There's only one way. Now, as far as what kind of postmodern world, what it would mean to live in a postmodern world, there are a few people who saw this coming. Does anybody recognize the slogan, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength? That was the motto for INGSOC, the party that was in control in George Orwell's novel 1984. C.S. Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, shows the beginning of some ideas of people who are looking at the world through a postmodern lens. And maybe going farthest back of all, Fyodor Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov says, if there is no God, everything is permitted. One of his characters said that. And that is the postmodern view. There is no God, and so everything is permitted. 2 Thessalonians 2 says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. What do you suppose is the world's favorite Bible verse? This will be a good one. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever so believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. I think there was once upon a time when we might have said that. That's a verse which many Christians memorized at an early age, the gospel in a nutshell. But I don't think this is the world's favorite Bible verse anymore. I think the world's favorite Bible verse is judge not, that you be not judged. Because that sounds like you can't make any value judgments at all. Now, that would be taking that verse entirely out of context, and that's not what it means in the overall context. We are supposed to make value judgments and do them all the time. But in a postmodern world, they would like that verse because it sounds like nobody can make any judgments about anything. Value judgments, postmodernism, they don't want anybody to make any kind of value judgments, not about one culture over another, one civilization, one religion over another, or any better behavior. They would like to say they're all relative based on their, diverse background and cultures. You can't judge one over another. It's probably good that we talk a little bit about honor and shame. Way back in the discussion about Christianity and Islam, we talked some about honor and shame because Islam is a prominent honor shame culture. Um, but it's going to get us here in postmodernism too. So, to review a little bit of this is in Genesis 3, the first sin, Adam and Eve sinned, and their reaction in Genesis 3:7 says, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And then verse 10, he says, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. And then verse 21, the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them. But the point of these verses is that when Adam and Eve sinned, their first reaction was not to be convicted of their sin in a good way. Their first reaction was they were ashamed. And that's why they hid. He was ashamed. He was naked and he was ashamed. And God took care of their shame. He made these skins and whatnot. However, God did not focus on the shame. He focused more on sin, on what's right and what's wrong. And throughout the entire Bible, the focus is on sin and evil, righteousness and judgment. The law talks about what's right and wrong. In the New Testament, even the law is holy and good in the New Testament, and the focus is always on right and wrong, sin and righteousness, truth or falsehood. Honor and shame are there, but they're a little bit more private. And in the Christian world, Judeo-Christian cultures were always right, wrong, truth, falsehood cultures. That's because it's taught by the Bible. But it's not the most natural of human impulses. The most natural one is the one which was shown by Adam and Eve initially. They're in the Garden of Eden. Honor and shame were more private. But most other world cultures are honor shame cultures. I won't go through a list of them. They take different forms in different places, but they're mostly honor shame, not right, wrong, truth, falsehood. Postmodernism is going to lead us to an honor shame culture here. That right, wrong, truth, falsehood thing, that's a Judeo Christian thing, and we're moving away from that. Our honor shame culture at the moment is that the new honor code takes precedence over truth or morality. And right now, we give honor to historical victim classes. If you were part of a group which was perceived as having been a victim in the past, then you get favored. If you're part of the sexual alphabet class, LGBTQ+, that group is favored too at the moment. And so if something is true, but it reflects poorly on one of these classes, then that truth has to be suppressed because we want to give honor to those classes. That's where the culture is today. Now, that's where we are today. And I don't want to say this is where we've ended up because I don't think we've necessarily ended. I think we're in a phase going from one thing to another. This version of honor shame, I don't think is necessarily sustainable. It doesn't mean it's going to be replaced by something better. It may be replaced by something worse, but I'm just not sure it's sustainable. For a society to be successful, you got to have people who are successful, not just have everybody who is a victim. And if you want to favor minority classes in a society which votes by majority rule, I'm not sure that that exactly works. But I can't really predict the future. I'm just saying that I wouldn't count on this being the end game as far as where our culture is going. And if things get too chaotic, um, people will eventually choose security over anarchy. In 1 Samuel 8:5, um, after a chaotic time or period of the judges, the people said, "Give us a king." And that leads me to the comment, I was trying to looking for a story that discusses postmodernism in biblical times, and I really think maybe there is one. It's at the tail end of the book of Judges. Really, there's two. In those days, there was no king in Israel. That's Judges 18:1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, Judges 19:1. And finally, in those days, when there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the point is not just that there wasn't physically a king in Israel, it's the point that there was no authority, there was no leadership. They didn't even look to God as being their king. They had no standard of right and wrong. It was as close as we can come to, for a biblical example, to a postmodern culture. And in those passages, there are two stories embedded. The first one is about Judges 17 and 18. It talks about a man and his mother. They behave in an immoral manner. They set up a rather very well-to-do idol, a very rich idol, and they hire a Levite who acts as their own personal priest. And then the Dan tribe comes along and acts as a bunch of thugs and pulls the Levite and the idol away. And the story is kind of there to tell how the Dan tribe ends up in the far north when they were supposed to be on the coast. That's the area where they were allotted. So it explains something historically, but it's a pretty miserable story because nobody behaves well at all. There's no good guys in the story. And then the last story is even worse. Judges 19 through 21. This was so bad that there was a prominent Bible commentator who said you shouldn't read this story. It's the story of a Levite who has a concubine. So, of course, he shouldn't have done that. The concubine runs away and behaves unfaithfully. So, of course, she shouldn't have done that. He goes to meet with her father, brings her back. When he's trying to bring her back home, he stops in the town of Gibeah, where the men in Gibeah behave about the same way the men at Sodom and Gomorrah behaved. They come out and they demand that she be brought out, and they rape her all night and leave her for dead on the doorstep. And then the Levite, he cuts her body into 12 parts, sends it to all the 12 tribes of Israel, gets them all riled up. They come and make war against the Benjamin tribe. It ends up in a total fiasco, but they eventually win. And then they're feeling bad because they've wiped out one of their tribes almost. And so they handle it in maybe one of the worst ways imaginable by coming up with a way to kill some more people and provide wives for the men that are left in the Benjamin tribe. Anyway, it is a terrible, terrible story. And not only are there no good guys in the story, it's like they're all bad. And you still have to pick a side. I think I would identify with the all Israel tribe, but there aren't really any good guys in the story. And one of the reasons I would mention this is because it may seem like in the earlier part of the discussion today, I've zeroed in a little bit on some classes which might identify with left-wing politics in the United States, and maybe I did, but this story is an example which shows that there may be a side you need to pick politically, but there aren't any good guys in the postmodern world. As Christians, we have to hold up to a biblical standard, and that may require us to indicate that no matter which side we're on politically, we have to confess that nobody is walking in righteousness. I've never even heard a sermon on these stories, and it's probably because the subject matter is so disturbing. No good guys. Now, For evangelism to people who are coming from a postmodern outlook, I wouldn't try to use reason too much. I mean, you can try, but they're coming from a worldview where they've largely rejected reason, and so that's probably not going to be most effective. I would be aware that a good number of those people who are adults may have come out of church experiences which were just genuinely bad church experiences. And so, one of the best ways probably to evangelize them is to build relationships of friendship so they can have a better relationship with a believing Christian. And maybe that's a bridge which the Lord can use to reach them. And finally, we should always let the scriptures speak. God can speak to the heart of people through his scriptures in ways that we can only imagine. And this is the last verse on the last page of the last lesson uh, that we're teaching on Christianity and other religions. And it talks about in First Chronicles 12 some different people who supported David. And in the list, in verse 32, it says, of Issachar, that's the tribe of Issachar, there were men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. And it would be my prayer that through this study, we would be people who had a better understanding of the times which we're living in, and that we would know what we, the church, ought to do. And that's it. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion this week.